happening, what we're seeing is the history of the civil rights movement is undergoing what, oh, I just marked you absent. Who is absent over there? Huh? We'll fix that. The history of the civil rights movement is undergoing this change, as all history does, as we round off the sharp edges and create a narrative in society that is easy for people to understand and kind of popular amongst history. Well, with the civil rights movement, that's scary, and what we're seeing and what I'm seeing in the last little bit is kind of some of the problems with that, is the history, the historical record, and what people are talking about the civil rights movement being is not at all what the civil rights movement was. That the civil rights movement that we're talking about in popular culture, the civil rights movement that we're applying to current events is not the civil rights movement of reality. And so what today and next class is going to be is you going deeper, you finding that complexity, that we want to make sure that the civil rights movement that you understand coming out of class is well beyond what most people think of it, because I'm telling you right now that what most people would say the civil rights movement was is so generalized that it's wrong. And so what we need to do is we need to see that complexity that really is true about the civil rights movement, so we don't see it applied incorrectly. So what I want you thinking about is what the real legacy of the civil rights movement should be. Now, we've got 2 days to come up with a much more complex, better understanding than what is being shared out there. Obviously, that's not enough time. That if we had a week, it wouldn't be enough time. That I have taught this subject and looked at sources of this subject for 15 years. I have done week-long studies on it. I've read probably over a dozen books on it. That, you know, there's no, you know, that there's, the complexity just continues. That the deeper you get into it, the more complex it gets. But we want to make sure that you guys have a much more complex understanding when these days are done. Okay, so I'm gonna set up the first little bit of it, then we're gonna dive into a whole array of sources in order to get this. So what you are looking at is the very top. We are looking at kind of context. So we're going to talk a little bit about this together. I'm going to jot a couple things down. We're going to talk about some things. You can kind of write down the things you think are important to understand the context of this question, and whatever you kind of need. That these are your notes, they're not mine, so kind of jot down what you think. So talking about getting here, how do we get to the civil rights movement? What's the context of answering this question about the real legacy of it? Well, we could go all the way back, and you guys mentioned Civil Rights Acts, you guys mentioned the Reconstruction Amendments and things like that, and the Civil War and Emancipation. We're gonna keep it to kind of the 20th century, and so some of the context of the Civil Rights Movement has to start with Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and the beginnings of the NAACP. Remember, Wells and Du Bois are going to found the NAACP and the crisis in the turn of the century. And so that's going to start this protest against conditions and against the changes that are happening. Socially and culturally, you guys have looked at and talked about, I've seen it in some of your other work, the Great Migration. So the Great Migration that starts with World War I continues after the war is over, continues with the rising industrialization in the north and northeast and the west in California, continues through World War II as people relocate to the west coast and to northern cities. Now, obviously the Great Migration has to do with African Americans leaving the Deep South and the Jim Crow South, but they are a part of a larger migration of people as well. Following World War I, World War I helps lead to the Great Migration. World War I also helps lead to the Harlem Renaissance and jazz music, and we know that African American culture, as a result of the Great Migration, as a result of the relocation of communities of African Americans all through northern cities and more combined and living together in cities, is going to lead to outpourings of culture like jazz, like the art of the Harlem Renaissance, the poetry, the writing of the Harlem Renaissance. And of course, if we're talking about greater American culture, nothing is more significant at this point than jazz, but this also leads to the beginnings of the poetry of County Cullen and Claude McKay and Langston Hughes, and we start to see a stronger voice of Black identity, Black pride, and certainly leadership of guys like Marcus Garvey, who's going to be an outspoken Black activist and kind of take things to a different level. Black is beautiful, and Black nationalism begins to be spoken about in the 1920s. Wouldn't have been there without the Great Migration and Harlem Renaissance and the changes, and even the political efforts of W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And then, of course, World War II. So World War II is going to continue on the legacy of World War I, that in World War I, Black soldiers went off to France and showed up in France and realized that they were treated better in France than they were in the Deep South, and realized that segregation and discrimination were not, givens in society. And so they come back a little bit, kind of upset and expecting changes. In World War II, that little bit of change turns into a lot of change. And so African American soldiers serving in the war are going to come back to the United States in the late 40s and 50s and expect better things. The efforts of A. Philip Randolph and Roosevelt's reactions to Randolph's threat of a march during the middle of the war is going to lead to the federal government moving on civil rights for the first time in a long time. And so out of World War II at home, out of World War II on the battlefield and the sacrifice and commitment of Black soldiers, America is going to come out of the war with greater expectations for change and civil rights. In a lot of ways, people talk about World War II being the cause of the civil rights movement. So the problems. Now these are pretty simple and straightforward, but we want to make sure we understand and recognize that there's 3 or 4 levels of problems. The first is segregation. And segregation, and we talked about this, you guys did a good job analyzing and thinking about and considering evidence on segregation in Jim Crow South. Segregation are those state laws that demand private businesses, local and state governments separate different races of people. They're laws on the books. They're state laws, local ordinances that say different races have to travel in different parts of the bus. There has to be a separate entrance for Black patrons. That these are not just practice, that these are legal stipulations. You guys looked at some of those laws. So segregation is about separation. Segregation is about where you sit, where you eat, where you travel. And it's about imposing this separate kind of society for the two and separating them in a very visible manner. Disenfranchisement is different. Disenfranchisement is political. Disenfranchisement is taking away the vote. So at this time, the other thing that's done is that African Americans are stripped of the right to vote. They had voted during Reconstruction, but following Reconstruction and in the next 10, 15 years, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and all manners of practices basically remove the power and right of African Americans to vote, and they are disenfranchised across the South. Discrimination and racism, these are underlying ideas that kind of help support both of these, but they're completely different. That discrimination and racism are attitudes and actions of people that if you are not hired for a job because of the color of your skin, if you're not offered or you're not allowed to move into a neighborhood because of the color of your skin, or not given, not allowed to rent an apartment or a home in a place, that's not segregation, that's not disenfranchisement, that's just discrimination and racism, culturally and socially established. And then finally there's the violence, there's the lynchings. That, remember, 1920s and 30s are some of the high points of racial violence across the country, and those aren't going away. And it's hard to put these things into context, but think about when a violent act happens in today's society. Now, today's society, we have a little bit different things going on, like social media allows us to be much more aware of things. But think about if there's violence in Charlotte, or if there's a violent, shocking act. It kind of shakes everybody up. Thinking about the girl in South Carolina who was kidnapped and murdered. Think about if those things are happening on a monthly basis in a state. If there is not a random, violence might happen, but more so the regular occurring expectation of violence, that it's not really such a surprise as just a way things happen. Think about what kind of a culture that creates, and that's what we saw. That's what you guys already looked at when you analyzed Jim Crow.